It's called the esophageal hiatus. That opening in the diaphragm is called the esophageal hiatus. And then after the esophagus passes through that hiatus, it joins the stomach. When the esophagus is not distended with food, it tends to collapse upon itself. Okay? All right, we looked at some of the features of the esophagus. We said it's got a non-characterized stratified squamous epithelium. We didn't see it in any of our slides, but particularly in the distal third of the esophagus, you may see glands within the lamina propria. Those are called cardiac glands. Okay? These glands produce mucus. With regard to the mucosa, the muscularis mucosa, remember that's the third component of the mucous membrane, is thicker in the esophagus. It's more prominent in the esophagus than any other organ in the GI tract. So that's one of the identifying features. Okay? Secondly, the submucosa contains a lot of elastic fibers. And that's the reason why when the esophagus is not distended with food, it collapses upon itself. So that the lumen of the esophagus does not appear nice and circular like this. Instead, the lumen, when it's collapsed, looks more like this. In other words, it's partially collapsed because of the elastic tissue within the submucosa. We said that the submucosa may contain, and we've seen examples of true esophageal glands. Some people call them deep esophageal glands. We saw a duct, God bless, leading from the true esophageal glands to the surface. Okay? The muscularis externa has the typical pattern, intercircular, outer longitudinal. But what's different from the rest of the GI tract is that you find skeletal muscle. In fact, the proximal third of the esophagus is entirely skeletal muscle. The distal third is entirely smooth muscle, and the middle third is mixed. And then we said that the outer layer of the esophagus is made up of an adventitia, simply loose connective tissue with some pockets of fat. Okay. Now, earlier I said, look at your handout, the esophageal hiatus. That's that opening in the diaphragm through which the esophagus travels to meet the stomach. Where it meets the stomach, the inner circular layer of the muscularis externa is thickened. It forms a sphincter. You can call that either the gastroesophageal sphincter or the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay? Everybody good? Let's talk about the stomach. The stomach's going to look like this. Okay? Here's the GE sphincter, gastroesophageal sphincter. Now, this part of the stomach here that surrounds the junction with the esophagus, this part here is called the cardiac region. All right? Hopefully you remember that. What do we call this dome-shaped region here? That's called the fundus. Anytime you have a dome-shaped region of any organ, it's called a fundus. Now, the distal part of the stomach is shaped like a funnel. Kind of like this. Let's say here's the esophagus here. Here's the duodenum. All right, so the term we use for this distal funnel-shaped region is called the pylorus. We can further subdivide the pylorus into this part here called the pyloric antrum. And distally, the part of the pylorus that meets the duodenum is called the pyloric canal. This part of the stomach that's left is called the body of the stomach. So we can subdivide the stomach into different regions. Just as we saw with the lower esophageal sphincter or the gastroesophageal sphincter, where the stomach joins the duodenum, the inner circular layer of smooth muscle thickens. Okay? And it forms a sphincter here. This is called the pyloric sphincter. It's going to control movement of gastric contents into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Duodenum. Okay. The upper margin of the stomach is referred to as the lesser curvature. The upper margin of the stomach is referred to as the lesser curvature. The lower margin, the inferior margin, which has a greater sweep, is called the greater curvature. Now, when the esophagus joins the stomach, there's an immediate change in epithelium. The epithelium transitions from stratified squamous to simple columnar. And it will remain simple columnar all the way down into the rectum. So from stomach to rectum, it's all simple columnar epithelium. Now, the surface of the stomach has what are called gastric pits. These are little depressions along the surface mucosa. This is the lumen of the stomach. Then the surface mucosa has little pits called gastric pits. These gastric pits are going to lead into glands that come off the surface mucosa, the surface epithelium. These glands are branched tubular glands. They can come down like this now. Okay? So if this is a columnar epithelium, it's going to line these glands. Okay, so these glands are diving deep into the mucous membrane, into the mucosa. Okay? At the distal end of the gland, you're going to have the muscularis mucosa right here. So you can have a thin layer of muscularis mucosa, not as thick as what you saw in the esophagus. Then deep to that, you can have a submucosa. You can have a muscularis externa. And then for the stomach, you can have a true serosa. Grossly. Let's see if we can find the stomach. And what's your stomach around here? There's got to be a couple of stomachs around here. Just look for the stomach. you can look at something and miss it still. Maybe it's under here. No. All right. Give me 2 minutes. Oh, here it is. I was looking at it. Okay, here's the stomach. Yeah. All right. If you look into, and we'll see this when we look inside the dog's stomach, there are longitudinal folds inside the stomach. These are called rugae. Okay? They allow the stomach to undergo distension when it fills up with food. So as the stomach becomes distended with food, the rugae become less prominent.
Rugae?
Rugae, R-U-G-A-E. Now, let's go back to the surface appearance, the mucosa. These gastric pits are going to be deeper within the proximal and distal parts of the stomach, within the cardiac region and the pyloric region. In the body and the fundus of the stomach, these gastric pits are more shallow. Okay. The cells that line the surface here, okay, and line the gastric pits, these are called surface mucus cells. They're not goblet cells, but yet they still produce a lot of mucus that forms a protective layer on the apical surface of these cells. It protects the surface of the cells, the apical surface, from the gastric acid. So these are called surface mucus cells. Again, the mucus is an alkaline mucus that protects against the acid pH of the gastric juice. Now, look here. As we pass from the gastric pits into these glands, the cells that line the neck of the glands are going to be called mucus neck cells. They're very similar to the surface mucus cells, but these are now lining the neck of the glands. Okay. Again, in the proximal and distal part of the stomach, in the cardiac and pyloric region, most of the cells that make up the glands are this type. Okay, mucus neck cells. But when you enter the fundus and the body of the stomach, you start to pick up additional types of cells. In the mid portion of the gland, and this is again within the body and the fundus, are these large, very pink cells, eosinophilic, called parietal cells. These are light-staining, large cells that produce two things: hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. So we say that parietal cells say hi. Hi. That stands for hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Remember, intrinsic factor is what allows for absorption of vitamin B12. It links to B12 from the nutrients in our diet, and that complex travels to the ileum, where as long as the B12 is linked to intrinsic factor, it gets absorbed. Okay? Now, at the base of these glands, down here, are these darker staining, smaller cells called chief cells. Chief cells, okay, are darker staining. They're going to produce two enzymes: pepsin, which is a protease, meaning it's an enzyme that breaks down proteins, and the other enzyme is gastric lipase. Lipase begins the process of breaking down lipids. Now, when the chief cells produce pepsin, they produce it in its inactive form called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen. When this pepsinogen reaches the gastric lumen, and mixes with gastric acid, the acid from the stomach breaks down pepsinogen into pepsin, which is its active form, which can then begin the process of protein digestion. Gastric lipase acts on a very limited type of lipid, butterfat basically. So we have a tiny amount of lipid digestion that begins within the stomach. Most lipid digestion occurs within the small intestine. Okay? But definitely with respect to protein digestion begins in the stomach. Okay. There's still another type of cell that's found not only in the stomach, but it's found within the small intestine as well. It's called an enteroendocrine cell. These are cells that release hormones. And one type of enteroendocrine cell that's found within the stomach is called a G cell. These cells don't stain well, by the way, so you won't necessarily see them under the microscope. But these G cells produce gastrin. Gastrin serves as a local hormone, which is also called a paracrine hormone. So gastrin is a paracrine, P-A-R-A-C-R-I-N-E, paracrine hormone, meaning it doesn't enter the bloodstream like other hormones. Instead, it acts locally. It acts on parietal cells to increase gastric acid secretion. Okay? So what happens is when food enters the stomach, the presence of food is going to stimulate the G cells to produce gastrin. Gastrin binds to receptors on the parietal cells and triggers their production of acid. Now, what your handout says is in addition to triggering production of acid, gastrin also triggers gastric